topic today is the person-centered approach of Carl Rogers to personality development. Carl Rogers lived between 1902 and 1987, so relatively speaking, he is a fairly modern theorist, whereas a lot of times when we talk about foundational personalities or key figures in psychology, we tend to talk about people who lived much longer ago. Carl Rogers lived until the last 30 decades or so. He was raised in a religious and conservative family in Chicago, in America, so that's another thing that sets him apart. When he was in college, he traveled internationally, and his interests moved from agricultural studies, which is what he began with, to history, to pastoral ministry, to psychology. And he was really impacted by the Great Depression, given the time frame during which he lived, and World War II, which I would argue probably he was also impacted by World War I, but he was quite young at the time, so probably not as much as World War II. So these are some of the contextual factors that we need to understand when we are looking at Carl Rogers and wanting to understand who he is as a theorist. If you remember, I've spoken before about how important it is to understand the context from which a person comes from in order for us to understand the development and the significance of his theories. So some of his philosophical influences are, of course, Christianity. He grew up in a religious home, and as you saw a moment ago, he actually studied pastoral ministry for a while. So while a lot of times when we talk about humanism as a movement in psychology or as a branch of psychology, we tend to think about it as something that's really far away from Christianity. If you look at it from a different, slightly different perspective, you actually see a lot of parallels in the humanism movement and kind of the tenets of Christianity that really have to do with God's unconditional love. When we talk about person-centered therapy or Carl Rogers' approach in general, we're really talking about having the same kind of care, empathy, love, and unconditional love specifically for people that God has for us. So we're told as Christians that we are to love one another, and that's exactly what Carl Rogers is talking about. What he sees as the main force of change in people is being able to receive love from others, and what could really be more godly than unconditional love. Other philosophical influences are empiricism, so careful observation and precise description, phenomenology, so the importance of experience, and you'll see that in a moment, and existentialism, the emphasis on freedom and responsibility. So these four different things together really make up the underpinnings of his person-centered approach or his person-centered therapy or person-centered theory, however you want to approach it. That term person-centered is used in a few different ways. So you might hear it as person-centered approach, you might hear it as person-centered therapy, you might hear it as person-centered theory, or sometimes you might just hear humanism when we're talking about Carl Rogers. So one way to begin thinking about how Carl Rogers saw people and saw personality shaping is to see kind of how he understood the fully functioning person as being, as presenting in the world. This is a quote from one of his writings. The fully functioning person is synonymous with optimal psychological adjustment, optimal psychological maturity, complete congruence, and complete openness to experience. Since some of these terms sound somewhat static, as though such a person had arrived, it should be pointed out that all the characteristics of such a person are process characteristics. The fully functioning person would be a person in process, a person continually changing. So this is a really important thing to understand about Rogers and where he's coming from in terms of how he conceptualizes the person as being in the world. He doesn't see us as having one end result, as being able to achieve something and being done with it. Instead, he really sees our entire life as a process, and we'll see in the next slide how that process takes shape and how the process influences and develops into the person, someone's personality. So remember that idea of process. It's never done. It continues to be worked towards. So a person is always in process. Person is always growing towards psychological adjustments, psychological maturity, congruence, and openness to experience. So the development of personality, or the development of the self, as Rogers conceptualized it, is an organized, fluid pattern of concepts and values. So he called this the self-concept. You can think of it as a person's understanding of themselves, which is organized, it's fluid, so it's changing. Again, that emphasis on the process rather than the end result. It is a pattern of concepts and values, so it's not any one thing. It's the interplay of lots of different things going on, including values and how the world conceptualizes, or the society in which somebody grows up in conceptualizes areas of life. And these are all based on interactions with the environment, so that which is all around you, society, political, environment, it's the time frame during which you live, and others, of course, those who are around you, who inhabit your home and your community, and of course individual factors. So when we look at this in terms of a chart, which I feel sometimes helps it make more sense when we talk about how Rogers talks about the self, or a person's self-concept, we see that there are individual factors, so individual values, individual kind of genetic factors that are encompassed in this section, which drive motivation, which drive our ability to intrinsically go towards something. Specifically for Rogers, that going towards is actually the process towards self-actualization. Then we have environmental factors, so our society, the Zeitgeist, or Zeitgeist, depending on how you pronounce it, the time frame, what is going on in the world, whether or not there's war or a time of peace during that person's life, and so on. So the general environment and other people that are involved. And this influences the self by ways of learning. So whereas these are intrinsic motivational factors, these are extrinsic motivational factors. So things that are learned. Another way to think about it is nature versus nurture. I like to bring that in as we talk about our different theorists, because the nature versus nurture debate comes up quite a bit and is really at the basis of each one of these theories. It's the theorist determining how they see the person developing, whether they see it as intrinsic or nature as being the leading cause, or nurture, or do they see it as kind of a combination. Here we see that Rogers specifically sees a person's self-concept developing out of a combination and interaction of both individual or nature factors and environmental or nurture factors. Then within the self, those organized fluid patterns of concepts and values are things like objects, people, images, thoughts, and behaviors, all of which again interact and come together to help a person develop a sense of self, a self-concept. Then once we talk about the self, we really have to talk about these two different selves, or different variations, if you will, of the self that Rogers conceptualized. There is the real self, or who you are, and then the ideal self. The real self is based on the things that we just talked about, based on all of these factors, who you are. You may not be perfect, you may have a number of flaws and so on, but this is who you are, warts and all, as they say. And then there's the ideal self. This is who you would like to be. This is how you would like to view yourself. And sometimes the real self and the ideal self are really far apart. So there's very, very little overlap. So you might be somebody who actually acts really, really selfishly, but would like to see yourself and would like to be as somebody who is very charitable. In this case, you're in a state, as Rogers conceptualized of it, of incongruence. And this incongruence causes a lot of internal conflict, and he sees this as the underlying reasons for example, psychopathology or depression or anxiety. Now, on the other hand, if who you really are and the things you do in your daily life, so your real self, is overlaps greatly with who you would like to see yourself as being. So if you're actually doing the things that you think you should be doing or would like to see yourself as doing, you're in a state of congruence. And that's the steps that you need to take, and that's the kind of what word shall I use? That's the state of being and moving towards self-actualization, or the fully functioning person that we talked about here. So here you have optimal psychological adjustment, maturity, and there's that complete congruence. That's all part of the fully functioning person. Now, Rogers then took all of these different things and put them into a theory, which you'll learn quite a bit more about when you take theories of counseling. He put it all together and called it the person-centered approach to therapy. It's all based on the work of Carl Rogers, and usually it's abbreviated as PSY, and it has applications beyond psychology. It's used in the workplace, it's used in education, and it's used in international relations, just to name a few applications beyond just psychology. When we talk about the person-centered approach, at first it sounds a little bit like we're talking about the person being the most important, which can be a little, to use Rogers' language, incongruent when we think about this from a perspective, from a Christian perspective, because we're really taught as Christians to be focused on others and helping others. But what he's talking about when he talks about being person-centered is understanding the world from the other person's perspective. So being able to see the world through another's eyes. And one of the greatest challenges for us is to have the same eyes towards same eyes for people as God has for them. In which case, that really is what person-centered really means. It means being able to understand the world from somebody else's experience and be able to provide them with that unconditional love just like God does. So overall, the person-centered approach is usually conceptualized as person-centered and experiential in terms of therapy, and you'll learn quite a bit more about both of these as you go on in your education. But it's important to understand that these two things are directly tied to Carl Rogers, his work, and the way that he conceptualized of a person and personality in general.